On today's show, we're talking about one of the most important characters in all of Major League Baseball. And that's right, it's a doctor.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked onto the World Series champion Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Texas Rangers fan covering this team for 11 seasons, including all 6 as the founder and host of this podcast. Joining me today is Mike Pialucci, head man in charge of sports over at D Magazine. How are you doing today, my friend?
Oh, I'm good, brother. Appreciate you having me back on. It's been a minute.
It has been a minute. We're here to talk about this feature that you wrote about Dr. Keith Meister. Before we get into all of that and what went off the rails for the Rangers this season, you can start today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, in October's feature of D Magazine, that's right, print media is alive and well and thriving with great stories, feature stories like the one that you wrote about Dr. Keith Meister, the Rangers team physician, the elbow guru, the surgeon specialist who kind of perfected the modern technique for what is now not quite Tommy John surgery. I have some alternate theories about what to call this new modified TJ surgery. But it was
2.0.
Yeah, something like that. I've got. We'll get to the theories later on the rebranding, renaming of this surgery. But there was a lot in there. I'm curious, just your overall thoughts about what you were thinking about, like heading into this piece. I know we talked a little bit about what this was maybe going to look like, and I think there's so much depth here. But what's something that stands out to you that you learned writing this feature?
Oh man, so much. I mean, so the background of this was that I know who Keith was. And sometimes, when you're a writer, there are things that are in the back of your head in terms of, I know this thing exists, but you sort of need a little spark to kind of step outside of your own knowledge bank and be like, oh, this is something that should have a bigger story that should be written about this. And it's not that he hasn't had coverage before, but every October, we do a Best Doctors issue at D. And you're always looking, there's lists of literally the best doctor in every single category, but you're always looking for a couple bigger features. And I was just like, the best elbow surgeon probably in the country is in Arlington. Why don't we do that? And that's really what kind of, I brought that to my bosses, and they're like, yeah, go for it. And I think going into it, I'm trying to think of the biggest thing that I learned. I mean, because, you do your research, and what sparked my curiosity about Keith in particular wasn't just the skill set. It was actually back in, I believe it was February before the season. He did a really good interview with Eno Saris at The Athletic. And it was the first time I saw him really, he's one of the folks who's really a big believer that spin is causing a lot of injuries as much, if not more, than velocity and workload. That's not necessarily a thing that people are fully in agreement on yet. But Keith not only believes that, Keith is really vocal about everything plaguing the sport and how it needs to be fixed. And that's not something that, when you think about a surgeon who he has 2 jobs, right? One is he's the Rangers team physician, so he works for the baseball team. The other is he runs his own clinic called TMI Sports Medicine. And it has 3 offices. The flagship is in Arlington, not too far from the ballpark. This is a guy who has every incentive to just let the surgeries keep rolling in, right? He could get all this proprietary data he has, and he could just, keep it to the Rangers and say, listen, we'll probably get into this, but I don't think these guys should be throwing certain pitches. It will heighten injury risk. And he could just keep that with them, let the Rangers get a competitive advantage. And then he could sit back and wait for every pitcher imaginable to roll into his clinic, because he doesn't just operate on the Rangers guys. He operates on everybody. He even operated on Brock Purdy, the 49ers quarterback, when he hurt his elbow, right? That's the level of stature that Keith has doing this thing. he could have just shut his mouth, and financially it's better for him. But he is out there and he does a lot of media, and he's trying to propose rule changes to Major League Baseball, and he's on the speaking circuit. He is very much, his old surgical partner at the University of Florida, where he worked before coming to the Rangers in 2004, we called him a crusader. And I think that's right. Like, Keith is very much a guy who wants to help fix baseball and save it from itself. And that was what surprised me, and what drew me to him was that a guy who has no real financial incentive to do this, who is one of the busiest human beings you'll ever meet, is still going above and beyond to try and make the sport a lot better than he found it.
Yeah, it's definitely a guy who has, multiple jobs, who really, like, you can tell, cares about the sport, cares about the people, cares about, what's best for, the whole, as opposed to just what's best for himself, which is really, really inspiring. And, one of the things that you wrote about in the article is, talking about which pitches to use or not use, the designer pitches. And one of the things that he also talked about was the development of these pitchers, something that has been not good for the Rangers for many, many years. And the focus is on that, and an argument that he had with an unnamed Rangers front office personnel, talking about, what you should prioritize, whether it's, velocity or spin or whatever this was. And, him pointing to guys like Cody Bradford, guys like Dane Dunning, of saying, like, hey, you don't have to throw 98, 99 with the craziest spin ever to be an effective big league pitcher. You've got those guys in your system. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because, those guys aren't the only guys in this Rangers system in terms of, pitching prospects that, don't throw 100, but still have some juice to them. Guys like Cole Drake, Mitch Bratt, Josh Steven, those are guys who kind of stand out to me as those kind of outliers that could, rely a little bit more on that pitchability, that feel, as opposed to the pure stuff. Is that something you think the Rangers have, like, factored into their own pitching development, of maybe that's one of the reasons why they're having so much pitching development success this year when they haven't in years past?
I don't know. And it's a tough question to ask, right? Because it's worth noting that is Keith's vantage point. But, I talked to John Daniels for the story, and John brought up, because, one of the things about Keith is he speaks his mind. He is a dude. He's a New Yorker. He doesn't mind saying what he feels. And, John and Keith overlapped the organization for 15 years, more than 15 years. And so they certainly were close. And so once upon a time, John was one of those executives that Keith would be challenging. And what John pointed out, and, it's a 5,000 more magazine story, so you can only go in so many detours with this stuff. But, like, John and I were talking. He's like, look, like, that is how Keith feels. But at the same time, in baseball, we do have a lot of data that shows that the guys who are throwing harder and faster with more movement, who are getting more swing and miss, are more effective. So what the debate really comes down to for me isn't necessarily ceiling, because, Dane Dunning and Cody Bradford were not the Rangers' best pitcher this year, right? It's Nate Eovaldi, who, even after 2 Tommy Johns, still throws pretty hard. And Jacob deGrom comes back from his second Tommy John, and even a quote-unquote diminished Jacob deGrom is throwing 99, because that's just Jacob deGrom. But I do think the argument, and this is very much what Keith believes too, is, longevity and reliability. Because look at what we saw with the Dodgers last night in the playoffs. Nobody spins more baseball than them. Nobody has more per capita talented arms than them, but they blow out left and right, and you're left in game 4 of a playoff series going to a bullpen game, because you don't have any starters that you can trust to be healthy on the mound. So the idea isn't necessarily just, well, is Dane Dunning going to be better than Jacob deGrom? I don't think that's necessarily a fair question to ask in and of itself, because he probably won't be. Now, you could, another guy that Keith did mention, who used to be in the Rangers organization before thriving in Chicago, was Kyle Hendricks, who was really good at his peak. So you can kind of project, okay, maybe there's a really good outlier. Maybe if we really develop the craft of pitching, these guys will find the ceiling, not just the floor. But I think there's a very good argument to be made for the floor, for the dependability of, a guy, if you go back a little bit further, another guy I talked to for the story, a Colby Lewis, who got Tommy John in high school. He was actually the last Tommy John surgery that Frank Jobe, who was the pioneer of the procedure, Colby's the last guy he operated on. And Colby's elbow lasted his whole career. We don't see that anymore. That now it's you blow out and you're probably getting another repair in about 5 to 7 years. But Colby Lewis, there was a lot of value to this guy being a third starter who paid 200 innings a year every single year, because you knew what you were getting and you weren't just having to roll the dice. Because yes, you could be the Dodgers and have tons of resources, but if guys get hurt, it doesn't matter. And yes, you could be Tampa, who seems more than most others to have found a secret sauce of just the amount of really good pitchers they developed. But if they all keep getting hurt and you don't know which ones are going to be on the mound in a given year, which is what's happening in Tampa, then what is it really worth to you if you're having to overhaul and change out a rotation all the time? There's a reason that last year, even Tampa, with all these arms they have, still had to go buy Aaron Savali at the deadline. I think it was this year, right? That they brought in Savali, or was it last year?
It was last year. Then they shipped him out this year to
right.
back to Cleveland.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're totally right. Yeah. So this is absolutely a thing that, I think it could be a shades of gray. It doesn't have to be black and white, right? Even if you don't buy what Keith is selling in terms of cut down on sweepers, which the Rangers don't throw sweepers. And for the record, he credits Chris Young for that, not himself. I didn't get to talk to Chris for the story, but Keith is very adamant that was Chris Young more than him. At the same time, if your doctor, who is the premier elbow surgeon, is saying, hey, man, I'm seeing MRIs, nobody else is, you shouldn't let these guys throw this, I'm pretty sure, his opinion was taken to some kind of account, right? But it doesn't have to be either or. Even if you're not a believer in, hey, you could build the whole house out of Cody Bradford and Dave Dunning. Well, even if you have 2, maybe 3 guys in the rotation like that, and you could have 2 to 3 really higher end, higher ceiling guys with, probably some safety net behind them, or more of them because of probably injuries and variants, you might be able to make a really good, durable rotation out of that. And maybe that's where this needs to go if there's a happy medium, because it's worth noting that for as much as Keith Meister knows, as much as he sees, he doesn't have a solution for this any more than anybody else does, right? The question of this year, the storyline of the year with pitching was, how do you keep guys them out? And nobody actually knows.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into a little bit more exploring that, what some potential solutions might be, including a very radical one that he proposed right after this word from our sponsors. This show is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best way to get in the action on sports on most states across the country. You can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. PrizePicks is the best way to get in the action on sports in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money on the sports action, so join over 10 million users and sign up today. PrizePicks puts its members first, so withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my pick hits, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Download that PrizePicks app today, use code LOCKEDONMLB, and get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. This episode is also brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. It's time to explore your favorite U.S. cities across the country, even your baseball rivals, because Booking.com can make you a fan of any U.S. city. With hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more on Booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay, even in your baseball rival city during the postseason. Now, you go check out all kinds of different wide varieties, including, whether you want to go to Houston, you want to go to Seattle, you want to go to, none of those teams are in the postseason anymore. But no matter who you're rooting for this postseason, Booking.com can make you a fan of any city. The right stay can make you a fan of anywhere. So go check out Booking.com. Booking.yeah. I'm here with Mike Paolucci talking about his feature story about Dr. Keith Meister and how to save baseball from itself. I think that, his perspective is definitely one that's valid, one that we were talking about earlier of, the reality of pitching is that if you're throwing harder, if you've got more spin, if you got some crazy breaking ball, like say, I don't know, for instance, maybe a 93 mile an hour slider, 95 mile an hour slider, it is easier to get batters out. But balancing those things is such a difficult thing for the sport of how to fix it. I feel like there's a million different solutions that have been proposed, whether it's, bringing back sticky stuff. Max Scherzer has been a vocal proponent of that. But one solution that he proposed that I think is maybe a little too dramatic, but would definitely be effective, is eliminating foul balls with 2 strikes. I feel like that would just fundamentally change the game of baseball. In terms of just saving pitchers' arms, I think it would be the most effective. But I don't know about you, but I feel like that would just vastly give just such a huge advantage to pitchers as opposed to hitters, and just completely drag down offense in baseball. What was your thought when he suggested something like that to possibly save some workload on the pitchers?
Yeah, I mean, so his argument, And I don't think it's going to happen. And I've certainly talked to other people who, one of these things about, Keith is like when you meet people who know him, like, if I know about this, there are a lot of people who know about this because he loves talking about it. And he has thought about it and he's done the research. And there's a synthesis to it. It's just a matter of how radical do you want the game to change, right? His argument is kind of threefold. It's like, one, you save the pitcher's arms because, at-bats can be so much shorter. Fewer foul balls, can't do that. I think that's the commonplace one. Number two is, well, if their at-bats are going to be a lot shorter and baseball wants to, what is the big aim of baseball the last couple of years? Shorten game time. Well, this is a very easy way to do that. And maybe you can go back in the other direction. There are some pitchers who, think the pitch clock has contributed to injuries. From what he was telling me, he thinks the younger ones aren't that concerned about it. It's more the older ones who are a little more stuck in their ways. That wasn't terribly high on the list of injury factors he thinks are out there. But, again, like maybe it's a deal where you get rid of the pitch clock if you shorten games in this way, or maybe you just make the games even shorter with the pitch clock and with shorter bats. But I think the real argument for why, I think it only goes so far if you make the argument about it's an injury-related thing. I think the way you get more mileage out of this argument for trying to get it adopted, and this is Keith's argument too, is like, look, like we all want baseball to be a more watchable product. And it is still, even though it is not quite as much of a 3-true outcomes game as it was maybe a few years ago, it's still a thing. But think about it. If you only have 2 strikes, you can't be doing foul balls to extend counts and wear pitchers down and try to keep you in the at-bat. Well, what do? Well, guys are probably be a lot more likely to just hit for contact. They're probably a lot more likely to bunt. They're going to get more balls in play. You get more balls in play, then suddenly you have a lot more watchable product because there's more small ball and there's, maybe more doubles and triples as opposed to just swinging for the fences or trying to foul off stuff till you get on base after like a long walk. And so if you combine the 3 factors of shorter games, more watchable, and guys get hurt less, you can see how that's a pretty effective sales pitch. And to his point, he mentioned how, and Keith's one of these guys who, it's worth noting, Jamie Reed, who's the head trainer for the Rangers, or really his title's above that now, but that's functionally a lot of what his role is. Jamie pointed out that team physicians are not actually in the ballpark every night, right? It's the training staff that is. Physicians are probably there the next day if you need to see them, et cetera. Well, Keith, for 17 years, was there every single game. He's still there a lot. Keith's the sort of dude who, his old partner in Florida kind of joked that they were training room rats. They just like to hang out and talk ball with people. So Keith is there, and he's not just doing medical stuff. He's talking to guys about pitch scripts. He's talking to guys about pitching. So he runs this role by everybody. He ran it by Max Scherzer, who Max is pretty contrarian type of dude, right? And he says, he's like, hey, even Max is like, you know what? Maybe it's not that bad of an idea. So do I think this is happening? I don't. Do I think that there's some logic to it to where, at first blush, I heard him like, whoa, this is out there. But then when you sit with him and he really explains it, it's like, you know what? It's not that crazy. I mean, there's absolutely a logic to it. I don't think that's the route that baseball would ever go. But if they did, I think there would be a lot of appeal to it, even if there would be a ton of shock to the system initially of how radical of a change that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of guys who have had this surgery, this new internal brace that he kind of patented on a Rangers pitcher, Kyle Cody was the first one to get this kind of new UCL repair surgery. It's not technically the surgery that Tommy John had. It's fixing the same thing, a torn UCL, but using an internal brace that was, I think you talked about it being in Scotland where they first were working on this on ankles, making it a little different. I feel like maybe we call this new one, it's been called like modified UCL repair surgery with the brace. That feels like a little bit too wordy. Maybe we call it Kyle Cody surgery. Maybe we call it the Meister surgery. Like I don't know what your thoughts.
He doesn't want it to be the Meister surgery.
Okay, well then maybe we call it just Kyle Cody surgery.
Yeah, colloquially the people call it the hybrid surgery, right? Because it's part Tommy John, part and the Tommy John is a UCL reconstruction, an internal brace is a UCL repair. So if you get just a UCL repair or an internal brace on its own, it's really for stuff where you see damage, but, it used to be before this was brought to the States by a guy named Jeff Dugas back in, I believe, 2013. I have to go back to the story and see what year. But before that, it was if you have any damage, it's either you pitch through it and make it worse, or you just go and get a full Tommy John, and then you're out for the 12 to 18 months, but you might not have needed that. Well, if you get an internal brace, it's probably about 8 to 10. So, and it's less severe, obviously. So, UCL repair, UCL reconstruction, you put them together, that's the hybrid. That's kind of what it's being called now, is the hybrid surgery.
Okay, well, that makes sense. And there are three guys that are going to factor into the Rangers rotation in a big, big way next year that all had this surgery. I think all three of them were by Dr. Keith Meister in Jacob deGrom, in Tyler Mahle, and Kumar Rocker. And I'm curious if you talked much about, the full rehab process of like how much basically what boils down to is how big of a workload are these guys going to be able to handle next year. It's going to make, I think, a big impact on how well the Rangers succeed in 2025 and bounce back, and how much they're going to be needing to go be players in free agency in terms of bringing back,
Yeah.
more starting pitching.
Yeah, we didn't get too into the weeds about what the rehab was or those specific guys. I think some of it is probably, if I push that, he's pretty protective of guys' privacy, and there's absolutely some things he can't talk about because of HIPAA laws. So I imagine we probably wouldn't have gotten, too far down the road, even if I went that direction. What is unique about him, though, and I have had this confirmed by other doctors who work with him, is that most surgeons are not figuring out rehab plans for their patients. And that's not to say he's the only one who has input on that. But he is very diligent on being proactive about this is what rehab should look like, and being very proactive as far as checking in with people throughout the rehab process, especially guys in Texas. But really at this point, his network is so big that if he operates on a Justin Verlander, which he has, he knows someone in Houston who can kind of oversee this thing and understands what the procedure should look like. So yeah, he's a pretty fascinating guy. I mean, the amount of medical knowledge he has, the only guy who does as many surgeries on the elbow, even kind of close to his rate at this high of a level, is Neil Elatrash, who's the Dodgers physician. And there was a great story on him in the New Yorker earlier this year by Zach Helfand. But what makes Elatrash unique is that his patient load is still spread across all different types of surgeries. He still does ACLs. He still does shoulders. Keith does shoulders too, I should say, but he still does all kinds of things throughout the body. Keith used to do that, as most orthopedists do, but he kind of started specializing more and more because so many people wanted to see him for elbows and shoulders. So that's really the vast majority of everything he does now. So he does this now, but he's done all kinds of surgeries throughout his career. And he's got this knowledge of rehab, and he's so thorough and kind of, he doesn't make any bones about the fact that he's an obsessive dude. He's really boring into a lot of stuff. And so the amount of range he has, I think what makes Elatrash fascinating is that he's so good at a wide range of surgeries that he still does. I think what makes Keith fascinating is that he, from start to finish, everything to do with the getting hurt to getting back on a mound at full strength, he has a hand in that in a way that there are a lot of surgeons who just don't spend nearly as much time in pre-op like he does, as far as meeting with his patients and doing consults. Like those visits will run an hour because he wants people to feel really comfortable all the way through. Yeah, I'm going to be involved in your rehab, and I'm going to get kind of pissed if you aren't following my rehab plans, because, there are guys who just start throwing too hard too soon. And he's like, what are you doing? You got to kind of measure it up a little bit, man. It'd be very easy for a guy of his stature to do.
Oh, did I lose you there for a second? I think we lost connection for a little bit.
Yeah, it froze up.
There you are.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. No, you're all good.
Okay.
You're all good. But yeah, I definitely see your point on that, of him wanting to be that specialist. It is definitely makes him a very, very unique character in baseball, in what, for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, on a team that is the reigning World Series champs. Coming up, we're talking a little bit about this season, what obviously went wrong, and what ways they can find to fix it, right after this word from our sponsors. The show is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You can look at all kinds of different odds, including World Series odds. Right now, the Yankees are back to being the favorites to win the World Series, plus 200. Dodgers plus 320 after tying their series back up. Mets following that, and then the Padres. Or if you're feeling going out on a crazy limb right now, the lowest odds are the Kansas City Royals at plus 2,400, or those Guardians at plus 2,100. So go check out all the odds on FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Now we are here with Mike Piolucci, the head man in charge of D Sports and their sports coverage, all D Magazine and all of their sports coverage. And I want to talk to you about your thoughts about this season in general. I feel like it's so easy to get to the end of the season. Everyone's like, where did the Rangers go wrong? And I feel like that is such an easy and obvious answer, like question to answer of they didn't hit good. Everybody didn't hit good. And then that was it. That was pretty much the main thing of where this season went wrong. But I feel like what's frustrating, at least for me, watching these offenses in the postseason, that none of these offenses are really all that great. It feels like outside of the Dodgers and Padres, pretty much every lineup that made the postseason has like 3 good hitters max. And so I feel like for me, that's what made this season more frustrating, is that like nobody in baseball seemed all that great this season. We didn't have a single 100-win team in all of baseball. And it feels like the door was open, even in a down year, even with the Rangers having a down year, to kind of flip things back and at least get into the postseason. And, well, maybe they could have done that and then lost to the Tigers in 2 games, just like the Astros did. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this team bounces back. I know Chris Young has kind of talked about a lot of the improvements, him wanting them to be internal. What would you do to fix this team bouncing back to next year? Or is it just a case of everyone had a bad year, go get them next year, be better?
I mean, I think really that's kind of the sub point to the bigger conversation, which is the bigger conversation is how much money is Ray Davis going to outlay? And what does he, this past year, the line of reasoning for why there wasn't a lot of money was the uncertainty over the TV arrangement. Now they know what their TV arrangement is going to be. I'm of the mind that if you are owning a team in a top 5 media market in America and coming off of a World Series year when your revenue is going to projected to increase the next year because it always goes up for World Series teams, I don't think your TV situation should really be much of a concern for whether you should spend or not, right? This is what you are supposed to be doing as a baseball owner. That being said, is this a deal where they won the World Series, he got what he was after, he got people in the ballpark after it opened to the pandemic and there wasn't a lot of attendance, so now he's satisfied with where things are and he'll turn off the cash faucet for a while, regardless of what the reasoning is? Or is this a deal where, hey, you know what, he really was spooked by the revenues and now that there's a little more certainty and he got a taste of what it's like to not make the playoffs after winning a World Series, he doesn't like that and the money will go back up again? And I don't think anybody knows, but to me, when I hear that the improvements have to be internal, I kind of buy that as more of a, this is our resources versus this is truly an amount of, a full faith investment in our team and what we have. Because if you look individually, right, the upside of the ledger is this: Wyatt Langford full year is going to be fantastic. I'm very confident about that. We saw it in September, right? We really saw it in the second half of the season. But this is just how baseball works now. Zach Kreiser, who writes for us over at D, who used to be at Yahoo, just a fantastic writer who we're all lucky to have writing about this team twice a month now in Dallas, even though, he's got a national background. He's actually a really good piece piggybacking off of what Ken Rosenthal talked about early in the year, which is, hey, the age of these hitters storming into baseball and just being red hot out of the gate the way they were 2-3 years ago, don't expect that anymore. For a lot of reasons, a lot of which is just the fact that the minor leagues have just been strip mined in a lot of ways, and there's just less good pitching to go against all the time. So you're going the jump from any pitching you see in Double or Triple A to the bigs is so much higher now. And that's especially true for a guy like Langford, who we know had such a tiny minor league career because he's that precocious as a hitter. So Langford's going to be great. I'm not worried about that. And that alone is going to be huge because, that could be their best hitter next year next to Corey Seager. Full stop. I really believe that could happen as soon as next year. There is also the Evan Carter question. I don't know what the Evan Carter thing is going to look like. I don't think any of us know. But I think there's at least a very good argument for the ceiling there, that you could believe that there's a lot of growth if he's healthy, in a way that, say, if you look at the other side of the coin, do I believe that Leody Taveras is going to figure it out as a hitter? I don't. That isn't to say he doesn't have value in other ways, but is that a guy who even do I trust to run, WRC plus of 5 to 10% better consistently than the average big leaguer? I just don't believe that. Jonah Heim was brutal this year, right? A lot better last year. But the year before that, Jonah had a wild split of half of the year was fantastic and half the year was awful. Do I know what Jonah Heim is as a hitter? I don't. Does that mean he doesn't provide a lot of value either way? Of course not. He's an amazing defensive catcher and framer, and those things are important. Do I necessarily think that Jonah Heim is just going to suddenly bounce back and hit as an all-star level next year? He could. Do we have reason to expect that? No, given the volatility of the last 3 years. It really could go any direction, and I wouldn't be shocked. I've had a running joke about being the president of, a charter member of the Nathaniel Lowe Appreciation Society since the man got traded to the Rangers. But even I, after the last 2 years, have a lot of concerns if the power is ever going to forget being what you think it would be for a guy who's 6'4", 215. Is the power going to be at an acceptable level for Major League first baseman, even if his eye is really great? I don't think we have a lot of reason for optimism there at this point, Adolis Garcia, it was brutal this year. I don't even have to go into that one. So if you are buying that out of those 4 guys that I just named, can 2 of them really bounce back? Just play the odds, any 2. Okay, sure. But then your lineup is still considerably worse than what it was when they won the World Series. And that's all of that is before addressing the Marcus Semien question, which is, look, everybody knew the bill was going to come due for Marcus Semien at some point because they signed him as a 31-year-old and he plays a whole hell of a lot of innings. The guy is, just unbreakable, it seems, but he's going to be, he's inching into his mid-30s. This is a guy who has had a lot of up and downs. The season line ends up being good every year, but how he gets there, it's not the Corey Seager consistent path every single month. You can't rely on that forever. And where is the growth going to come elsewhere, in the organization? I guess Josh Young, everybody has banked on Josh Young for a long time. I know you are a big Josh Young guy.
I'm a founding member of that fan
of the Josh Young Appreciation Society. Yeah. But I wrote about this when he came back this year and how it was so, at the time Texas was still in the hunt, and it was, the thought was, okay, well, they'll get Josh Young back, and Josh is, maybe their best fastball hitter, and he's right-handed pop, and God knows they need some of that. But Josh Young hasn't actually been a great major league hitter yet. And that's not to say he can't be, but this is a guy who is older than you think he is, who's had a lot of injuries. Is it fair to expect him to pick up a lot of that slack versus just, hey, if this guy is a good complementary piece? And so you keep going through these things. You look at a Josh Smith, who was great in the first half, but there was always going to be some regression coming. It hit a little harder than I think everybody wanted it to. So then it becomes, well, can he channel, let's say, 80% of the first half, but also 80% better than the second half? Because then you have a really interesting piece. But again, Josh Smith isn't carrying your lineup. There's just so many things that the more you dig into it, the more, if I asked you, who do you feel confident is a really good hitter on this team? To me, it's Corey Seager. It's going to be Wyatt Langford, and I don't know. So I think something has to be done, but I don't know if they're going to do it. And the problem is, and this is where I think Chris is justified in saying, hey, let's see if the improvement could be internal without the elephant in the room of how much cash there's going to be. Nobody that I mentioned is bad. There are no bad players that I mentioned. There's nobody where you're looking, you're like, this guy is awful. So it's not like there's this screaming obvious situation where you can call bullshit and say, no, man, things are really terrible. It happened for a long time at these 3 spots, the way it was 3 years ago, right? When you could look at the whole roster and be like, oh, you could upgrade anywhere you want. Now, it's not really that simple anymore. There's a lot of guys who are, even the ones who can't hit are solid big leaguers in some way, shape, or form. So it's tricky. I think maybe it ends up being a deal where they stay true to their word and they go into the season with a roster that's fairly similar, but maybe they're aggressive in the way they were at the deadline 2 years ago. If at mid-year they don't like what they see, because, it's entirely possible. And I would buy this line of argument that, hey, maybe we don't have enough sample size in some of these guys. How did Adolis Garcia get this bad after his plate discipline had been improving steadily for 3 years? How did the bottom fall out so fast at this point, right? How did Nate Lowe, who it's worth noting, even last year in the World Series run, from September onward in the World Series run, he was a mess. And there's a reason for that, which is his mother was diagnosed with brain cancer. He had things going on. And he, when I spoke with him and did a story on him in the spring, he was very open about that. Well, before then, he was hitting really well. And even though there have been times in his career where he actually hasn't had a platoon split and has hit lefties well, which is one of the reasons I've always liked him, right? If you're a lefty who doesn't have a platoon split and you have a great eye, I'm going to like you Okay, that's the Evan Carter synthesis. That they let him play against, hit against lefties again. This is why I could be very much in the tank for an Evan Carter. But even when Nate Lowe was not hitting lefties 2 years ago, and before that season went off the rail with personal issues, he was crushing righties still. He was absolutely battering the crap out of them. So is Nate Lowe suddenly a bad hitter? I don't know. I don't think he is entirely. Whether or not he has the pop to be what you want, that's a different question. But is he such a bad hitter that that after this year that you preemptively have to make a big upgrade at first base? I wouldn't fault them if they did, but I also wouldn't fault them if they said, you know what? This guy has won a Silver Slugger. This guy has won a Gold Glove. This guy has, at different points, had every facet of a great first baseman. He just hasn't put them together yet. And he's still, I think, 29. I could see the argument for it. I could see the argument with Jonah Heim of like, hey, he's not this bad of a hitter. I don't know how good of a hitter he is, but I'm not going to bring in anybody to take his at-bats when he's that good of a defender. He's not this bad of a hitter. Give me 3 months in the season to see what this is. So I think what this is going to be, if I had to guess, is there will probably be some tweaks. But I think they really will try to do a lot of internal improvement, maybe partly because of money, maybe partly because of sample size of some of the guys who regress. They aren't sure that regression is real versus just a bad campaign and you could get things back to where they were 2 years ago. I don't know if that's what I would bet on as a team that, again, I'm a big believer that in baseball, when you don't have a salary cap and you play in this market and now you've proven you can win a World Series, you should be aggressive all the time. And I don't accept a lot of excuses for not spending in that sort of scenario because that's just not what your reality is. But I at least can see a synthesis for let's get a little more data and hopefully they stay in the hunt because, let's not forget, Bryce, they're not afraid to have a rocky early part of the season and think they can get back into it. That was the whole strategy with the rotation this year, right? They stacked up so many injured guys and said, look, stay afloat to the All-Star break, then we'll figure it out. And it didn't work, but it didn't work for reasons that had nothing to do with the pitching. So if nothing else, I could see them being emboldened by that strategy of saying, hey, we already rolled the dice a year ago of we can write off 2 months if it has to get to that and stay in the hunt. And by the way, it actually turned out pretty well for us in the thing that we thought it would, which is, hey, our pitching was fine. So maybe they sit there and say, you know what, let's do the same thing with bats this year. Maybe we just, if we have a really brutal first 2.5 months of the season hitting, we make changes, but maybe we're right and things get better than we think, even if, the outside consensus is why would it? So then why would we go more aggressive than we have to out of the gate?
Yeah, I definitely feel that. And I think there's room for optimism of a bounce back from Nathaniel Lowe, from I think more of Adolis Garcia than Jonah Heim, because catcher offense, I mean, I have no idea what the heck to make of it from basically any catcher in all of Major League Baseball. But I'm hoping for an exciting offseason. Maybe they shock us all and drop $500 million on Juan Soto, bring him in and make us all look stupid for calling ownership poor or unwilling to spend. But Mike, thank you so much for joining me. Y'all go check out D Magazine, all of their great sports coverage. I think that today is Stars opening day. Lots of great coverage there, lots of great Rangers coverage, and of course, go read that feature article on Keith Meister. Thank you so much for listening. Mike, thank you so much for joining, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy World Series champion Texas Rangers baseball.